The morning stage came and went. Dust settled, boots walked off, laughter trailed behind veils and bows that belonged to other people. Naya didn't move. She just sat on the wooden bench outside the mail-order bride office, hands folded over a worn envelope. Her braids were tight, her dress was plain. Her eyes, half Apache, half hope, watched the road until the road gave her nothing back. She wasn't surprised. They didn't want her kind, said she looked wild, said a wife shouldn't come from a bloodline the railroad once tried to bury. Beside her, a cowboy sat in silence, hat low, shoulders broad, letter unread in his lap. No one had come for him either, and no one would. Not after all the letters he sent stopped getting replies. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. But the silence between them felt less empty than everything else that morning. And in a town built on deliveries, debt, and departures, two people nobody waited for had just stopped waiting. The bench outside the mail-order office had two cracks in the wood and one loose board that creaked every time someone shifted their weight. Neither of them moved enough to make it creak. The woman, her name was Naya, kept her back straight. Her hands were still folded over the envelope, though she'd stopped reading it an hour ago. There wasn't much in it, just a name, a place, and a line that said, "Please don't come if you're Apache." It wasn't signed. She had come anyway, because the name was real, because the hope for a moment had been too. The man beside her said nothing. He'd been there when she arrived and still hadn't moved. His name was Calder, though she didn't know that yet. He held a different kind of letter, one that had no envelope because it had never been sent. The edges were folded, the ink faded in places where his thumb had rested too long. It was his third letter to the same woman. She never wrote back. He stopped checking the post 2 weeks ago, but he hadn't stopped sitting on the bench. Until today. "I'm not who they were waiting for," Naya said softly. Calder didn't look at her. "Me neither." Her voice was smooth, low, like a creek that hadn't run dry yet, but might. He nodded just once. Silence again, but not the kind that cuts, the kind that acknowledges. Inside the office, the sound of boots and bustle continued. Laughter, rustling paper, an excited bride gasping at the sight of a well-dressed groom. Someone shouted instructions about luggage. Someone else was crying. Naya didn't flinch. Calder just adjusted his hat lower over his eyes. A minute passed. Then another. Then Naya asked, "Where are you headed after this?" Calder shrugged. "Nowhere urgent." She nodded slowly. "Good place. I thought about going there myself." That earned her a faint smile, not with teeth, but with breath. She stood first. Her boots hit the board softly. She walked to the end of the porch and looked out at the dirt road, the sun-baked rail post, the stray dog dozing in the shade. She didn't ask him to follow. He didn't ask where she was going. But when she started walking, he did stand up. He tucked the letter into his vest pocket, tipped his hat toward the office, and fell into step beside her. No introductions, no destination, just two strangers no one waited for. Noticing that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be strangers for long. They walked through the heart of town without speaking. The general store, the barber's, the stable where flies buzzed, and a tired mule snorted as they passed. Most people didn't look twice, except the banker. He looked twice at Naya, then at Calder, then away. Naya didn't comment, Calder didn't acknowledge, but they both saw it, and they both chose silence over saying what they already knew. He took her to the creek behind the church. There was a bench there too, older, more worn, carved initials along the sides, most faded, some crossed out. They sat again. She folded her hands the same way. He rested his elbows on his knees. Birds chirped somewhere nearby. A crow landed on the fence post across from them, tilted its head like it was listening. "You from around here?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "Far enough," he nodded. "Me too." She looked at him then. Really looked. Sandy hair, faint scar along the jaw, eyes like fields in October, dry, quiet, waiting for something to grow again. "You write letters?" she asked. He nodded. "I used to." She tilted her head. "Me too." Another silence. Not uncomfortable, just spacious, like a room neither of them had walked through yet. He pulled a small tin from his coat and offered her a dried apple slice. She took it without hesitation, ate slowly. When she finished, she said, "I used to hate apples, until someone taught me they weren't all the same." He looked at her, just a little sideways. "And now?" She licked her thumb and grinned. "Now I'm glad I didn't stop at the first one." Later they walked again. No plan, just motion. He showed her the old mill, half collapsed but still proud. She told him she once slept in a broken wagon during a lightning storm and never woke up more rested. They didn't ask about the past, only traded pieces of it when it came up natural. By the time the sun dipped low, they found themselves back at the post office. The bench was empty now. No brides, no grooms, just wood and silence. Naya paused. "I should go." "Where?" She smiled. "Nowhere urgent." He chuckled, then said, almost too quiet to hear, "You want to walk again tomorrow?" She didn't answer. Not right away, but she sat back down on the bench, same spot as before, then patted the space next to her. He took it. The next morning, Naya returned to the bench. Same dress, different braid. She had tied one side higher this time, like she'd been too tired to finish, or maybe just didn't care what anyone thought. The post office was quieter now. No carriages, no brides in white, no hopeful men checking the list of names inside. Calder was already there. 2 cups sat beside him, steam curling from the tin rims. He didn't say anything as she approached, didn't offer a smile or a greeting. Just pushed one of the cups toward her as she sat. She picked it up without hesitation. No cream, no sugar, still warm, still better than anything she'd had in weeks. "Do you always wait without talking?" she asked. He shrugged. "Only when I think someone might still come." "Still think she will?" He took a long sip. "No." Naya looked down at the letters in her lap. "Me neither." They sat in silence, sipping coffee like it had answers, like heat could explain absence. He stood first this time, walked 2 steps toward the edge of the porch. "Got a fence to mend today," he said, half turning back. She looked up. "I don't own a fence. You can borrow mine." She considered him for a second, then stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "All right." The Marson place wasn't far, an old property where Calder worked in exchange for a roof and space for his mule. The owner was gone for weeks at a time, running cattle between counties. Calder said it suited him fine. No questions, no clocks, just work and space to breathe. They walked the trail slowly, not because it was far, but because neither of them had anywhere better to be. He handed her a hammer. She didn't hesitate. The fence leaned in places, broken in others. Naya held the boards steady while Calder drove the nails. They didn't talk much, but when a board split and Naya cursed softly under her breath, Calder grinned. "Bad lumber," he said. "Bad aim," she replied. He chuckled. It was the first sound he made that wasn't out of necessity. When the last post was set, Calder wiped sweat from his brow and motioned to a stump. She sat without asking. He handed her a slice of bread, still warm from his saddlebag. "Made it last night," he said. She tore off a piece, chewed, nodded. "You cook better than most men I've met." "That's a low bar. Still counts." A hawk flew overhead as they finished the bread. Neither looked up. Calder leaned back on his elbows, face toward the sun. Naya watched him for a moment. Then without prompting, she said, "My mother used to braid my hair. Said it made me look civilized. Like that would matter." He didn't reply. Didn't need to. She wasn't asking for a reaction, just space. And he gave it. They worked 3 more fence posts before he spoke again. "You ever think about going back?" "To where?" He shrugged. "Wherever you were before." She shook her head. "There's nothing to go back to. Places don't miss you. People might. Then they should have written back." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." That evening he walked her back to town. Didn't say much. Didn't have to. The street was mostly empty now. A boy kicked rocks by the saloon. A dog barked from behind a laundry line. The wind smelled like cotton and dust and maybe something like home. As they reached the post office, she stopped. He stopped too. She turned slightly. "Tomorrow?" He nodded. "Same time." She smiled, but only a little. That was enough. The next day there was no coffee, just a folded blanket on the bench and a small loaf wrapped in paper. She sat and unwrapped it, still warm. He arrived a few minutes later, boots dusty, shirt sleeves rolled. She tore the loaf in half without a word and handed him a piece. They didn't talk about love. They didn't talk about the people who didn't show up. They talked about fence posts and bread, and whether the mule he took care of was smarter than most men in town. He said yes. She agreed. On the fifth morning, it rained. She thought he wouldn't come. She came anyway. He was already there. Damp hat, soaked coat, holding out a cup of hot something that wasn't quite coffee. She took it. They sat in the rain, said nothing. But both stayed until the sky cleared. And when it did, Naya looked up at him, water dripping from her braid, and said softly, "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you were never waiting for someone to come to you." "No?" "Number, I think you were waiting for someone who'd stay." He didn't answer, but he didn't need to, because for the first time, he stayed seated after she stood, and she stayed standing after he did. Neither walked away first. They just stood there looking out over a town that had once told both of them to leave quietly, and now barely noticed they were still there. By the end of the second week, folks around town had started to notice. Not with words, no one dared say much in a town that gossiped louder than it prayed, but with glances. The butcher's wife paused longer at her window when Naya passed. The man who ran the feed store always seemed to sweep when Calder tied his mule outside. No one said a word, but they saw. Two people who weren't supposed to matter, starting to. Calder never asked why Naya had kept the name of the man who rejected her, and Naya never asked why he still carried the third unanswered letter in his vest pocket. There were things you didn't ask when you already knew the shape of someone's pain. They just weren't your words to say. They spent their mornings walking the back ridge behind the church, where the cottonwoods swayed soft and the air didn't carry judgment. They talked about practical things. How many fence posts needed fixing, what to plant come spring, why her bread rose better than his, even though she never measured a thing. He once said it was magic. She told him it was experience, but she smiled when she said it, so he didn't argue. One afternoon, she found him fixing a broken wagon wheel behind the livery. "You ever finish that fence?" she asked. He looked up, wiped his brow. "Halfway. Got stuck on the south side." She nodded, set down the flour sack she'd been carrying, and rolled up her sleeves. "I'm not busy." He didn't say thank you, just handed her the wrench. They worked in silence, except for the occasional curse when the bolt wouldn't turn. Naya didn't speak until they were almost finished, then quiet. "You ever miss her?" Calder didn't look up. "No." She didn't press. Didn't need to, because a man who says it that fast either truly doesn't, or truly does, and can't afford to admit it. The sun was low by the time they finished. He walked her back to the boarding house where she rented a room by the week. They paused at the stairs. "You hungry?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. She opened the door without waiting for an answer. Her room was small, clean, one chair, one bed, one cracked window that faced the alley. She set a pan on the stove and sliced potatoes with the kind of rhythm that only came from doing it 100 times before. He sat on the floor back against the wall. Didn't ask if he could. She didn't mind. She handed him a plate when it was ready. They ate with their hands, dipping bread into the warm grease, saying nothing. The meal was quiet, but not empty. Later, as he stood to leave, she asked, "Would you write again?" He looked confused. "Letters," she clarified. "If someone wrote to you first, would you write back?" He watched her for a moment, then said simply, "I think I already am," and left. The next morning, there was no bench. Not because it was gone, but because they didn't need it anymore. He was already waiting near the edge of town, where the path met the fence line. He held a small sack of coffee in one hand. She carried a pan of cornbread wrapped in cloth. They walked without saying where they were going. Their feet already knew. At the creek, they sat on the same old stump. She rested her head on her knees. He watched a frog leap between stones. "I wasn't supposed to come here," she said. "I know. I lied to the man who wrote me. Told him I was half French. He didn't believe it, even in the first letter." Calder didn't flinch, didn't answer. But his hand, slow, steady, rested just a few inches closer to hers than it had the day before. "You ashamed?" she asked. "Of what?" "Of sitting with someone like me." He turned to her fully. "I've been sitting alone for years." She met his gaze, then quiet. "Me too." There was no kiss that day, no sudden declaration, just the soft sound of water and two people staying where they weren't expected to be. That night she left her window unlatched, not as an invitation, but as a statement. The next morning the latch was still open, and a folded piece of paper sat on the sill. One sentence. "I'd write to you if I thought you'd stay." She read it once, then tucked it under her braid, close to the skin, and smiled. The coffee was stronger that morning, almost bitter. Naya didn't mind. She sat cross-legged on the blanket Calder had spread beneath the cottonwoods, steam rising from her cup, braids still damp from the wash basin. The sunrise touched only the tops of the trees, leaving their clearing in soft gray shadow. He'd brought fresh eggs today, said he traded for them, but wouldn't say with who. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. But she smiled as she cracked one into the pan over the fire. They ate in quiet again. But the quiet had changed. It no longer felt like survival. It felt like understanding, like the kind of stillness that comes after a long storm, when the air is clean and you can finally hear your own breath without fear. Calder glanced at her as she packed away the dishes. "You ever shoot?" She looked up, surprised. "You mean with a gun?" He nodded. She shook her head. "Never had one long enough to learn." He stood, pulled a revolver from his hip. Old, worn, but well kept. He didn't hand it to her, just held it out, grip first. She took it slowly, eyes narrowing. "It's heavier than I thought." "They always are." He led her to a row of fence posts out behind the ridge. Empty cans lined the top rail. Tin, dented, sun-bleached. She aimed clumsily, fired once, missed by a foot, laughed under her breath. "Guess I'm not much of a gunslinger." He smiled. "It's not about the hit. It's about how you hold it." She steadied her stance. Hands firmer now. No shake this time. When she fired again, the can wobbled, just enough to fall. He didn't clap, didn't cheer, just nodded. And in that nod, she felt more seen than she had in years. They walked back slow, her steps lighter, his gaze longer. He caught himself watching the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. She caught herself walking closer than before. When their hands brushed once, accidentally, they didn't pull away. By mid-afternoon, they were in town again. The bench by the post office sat empty, as if waiting for ghosts. Naya paused, looked toward it, then kept walking. "Something wrong?" Calder asked. She shook her head. "I just remembered how small I used to feel, sitting there." He tilted his head. "And now?" She glanced at him, lips parting just slightly. "Now I feel tall." That evening, Calder brought her to the ridge where wildflowers had started blooming. Purples, whites, a few bold yellows. He didn't say why, didn't need to. She picked one without asking and tucked it behind his ear. He chuckled. "I look ridiculous." She stepped back, studied him. "Number you looked like someone who needed to smile." They sat on the edge of the ridge, boots dangling off the drop, air cool around their shoulders. "I wasn't born with much," Naya said, "but my grandmother taught me how to make something last, even when it wasn't meant to." Calder nodded. "Like cornbread?" "Like silence." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flat box. Didn't hand it to her, just opened it on his lap. Inside, a thin silver chain. Nothing fancy. A single turquoise stone in the center. "It was my sister's," he said. "She died before she turned 10. Had no one to leave it to." Naya didn't reach for it. She waited. He looked at her, then closed the box, handed it over. "You don't have to keep it, but I figured maybe it should sit with someone who knows how to stay." She held the box for a long moment. Didn't cry, didn't smile, just pressed it to her chest and said, "I've never had anyone give me something that didn't come with a price." Calder said nothing, but his hand rested beside hers on the blanket, palm up. She didn't take it, not yet, but her fingers curled just slightly in the space between, and that was enough. The sun dipped low. They didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed in the same air, watched the same horizon, shared the same stillness. When she finally stood, her legs shook, not from fear, but from something heavier, something real. As they walked back, lanterns glowed in windows. A fiddle played faintly from the saloon. Laughter echoed somewhere distant. But in the space between their footsteps, there was something softer, something building, like a rope being tied. Knot by knot, word by word, silence by silence. At her door she turned, held the box tight to her chest. "Why me?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "You could have waited for someone else, someone who belonged." He studied her face for a long second, then said, "I think I was waiting for someone who wouldn't leave." She didn't respond, but her fingers brushed his sleeve as she stepped inside, and the door stayed ajar. That night the wind howled through the alley, but she didn't shut the window. She left it open. For the first time in years. The whispering started small. A sideways glance, a muttered word outside the feed store, a door that didn't open when Naya passed by. She had expected it. Being half Apache and unclaimed by any man made her a question nobody wanted to answer. But this time, it stung differently, because for once, she wasn't alone. Calder heard the murmurs too. He heard them when he walked into the livery, and the stable hand suddenly found a reason to be busy elsewhere. He heard them when he passed the church, and the old pastor cleared his throat like he'd swallowed something bitter. But Calder wasn't a man of speeches. He was a man of choices, and that day he made one. At high noon, when most folks were hiding from the heat, Calder walked beside Naya through the center of town. Not on the edge of the street, not with a careful few steps between. He walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed, close enough for everyone to see. A child pointed. His mother pulled him away. The blacksmith looked up from his anvil and met Calder's eyes, but didn't say a word. Naya kept her chin high, her spine straight, her breath shallow. She didn't know whether to feel humiliated or honored, until Calder said under his breath, "Let 'em look." That night he brought her to the hill behind the Marson place, where the sky was wide and nobody else dared follow. He had cleared a spot. Blanket, fire, 2 mugs, not tin, ceramic. Like it mattered, like she mattered. "I'm not ashamed of you," he said. She didn't answer. She couldn't. So he tried again. "I don't care what they think." Still nothing. Finally, softly, "But do you care what I think?" She turned her face to him then, eyes full. Not of tears, but something older. Tired, grateful, afraid to hope. And then, the truth. "I think I stopped belonging a long time ago. And now you make me want to believe again." He reached for her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. And when he pulled her close, forehead to forehead, the fire popped beside them. And for the first time, she didn't flinch. The kiss wasn't perfect. It wasn't practiced or smooth or gentle. It was human. Rough with relief, soft with surrender, and more honest than either of them had dared to be in years. Later they sat with her head on his chest, his coat around her shoulders. "Someone's gonna come for you," she said. "They'll try. You sure it's worth it?" He looked down at her. "I'm sure you are." A pause, then her voice. "If you ever leave—" "I won't." She smiled, closed her eyes, and believed him. They spent the next days like thieves of time. Early morning walks with no destination. Conversations that drifted between nonsense and soul-deep truths. A shared biscuit from the bakery. A wildflower tied into her braid. His boots always next to her door. But peace never stays long in places built on fear. One morning as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, a rider approached. Dressed clean. Too clean. Carrying a badge that didn't belong to this town. He dismounted with a practiced ease and tipped his hat. "You called her, James." Calder stood slowly. "Depends who's asking." "Got a message for you. From Carson County." A folded note. No seal, no return name. Calder took it, read it, frowned. Naya watched him closely. "What is it?" He folded the paper once, then again. "Nothing that matters." But his jaw tightened. That night she found him fixing the saddle he hadn't touched in days. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm riding out in the morning. Just for a day, maybe two. She didn't press, didn't plead, but her hands shook as she handed him the food she'd brought. He reached for her wrist, held it. I'm not running. She nodded, but her eyes said otherwise. I'll come back, he said. And this time, she wasn't sure she believed him. It took 7 days for the dust to settle and her heart to harden again. Naya had lived through being forgotten before, but this time was worse, because for the first time in her life, she had let herself believe. Calder's absence cut through her calm like a paper-thin wound that never stopped stinging. She still rose before dawn, still braided her hair, still poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit. The second cup sat cooling on the windowsill. No one else touched it. On the 8th morning, she didn't make the coffee at all. She walked past the bench outside the mail order office, its wood graying under the sun. A new girl sat there, pretty, pale, nervous. Someone would come for her. Someone always did, but not for women like Naya. Not twice. That afternoon, thunder rolled over the hills. The clouds came dark and angry, the kind that made you feel small even before the rain hit. She stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, and listened. And then, footsteps, boots in mud, not hurried, not ashamed, just steady. Her breath caught before she turned. He looked ruined, soaked to the bone, hat bent, beard unshaved, hands blistered. But he was there. She didn't run to him, didn't scream, didn't cry. She only said, "You said 2 days." Calder looked up at her from under the brim of his wet hat. "I was wrong." She almost smiled. Almost. "Why are you here?" "I came back." "You always say that." He stepped closer, pulled something from his coat. Not flowers, not a ring, not an apology. A deed. To a ranch. To something broken. To something they could build. It was the Diller place, long abandoned, half rotten. A house with a sagging roof and a porch that leaned left. No neighbors for miles. No witnesses. No rules. He looked her dead in the eye. "I want to start something where no one else gets to tell us what we are." And for once, she didn't need to say yes, because she was already walking beside him. They moved into the Diller place before the rain stopped. There was no chimney, no doors that closed, no bed that didn't creak like a dying tree. But there was space and silence, and the kind of freedom that only people used to being watched could truly understand. They worked with their bare hands. He hauled lumber from town with an old mule named Bucky, who hated everyone but her. She cleared the weeds with a rusted blade, arms scratched, dress torn, grin feral. They fixed the porch first, then the roof, then the floorboards. Every day ended with their backs against each other, skin raw, laughter slow and sore. At night, she fell asleep to the sound of his breathing. Steady, earnest, there. And he woke to the smell of her hair and the weight of something he never knew he needed resting against his chest. The town whispered. Of course they did. "How long you think she'll last?" "You hear he bought land with Apache blood in it?" "She hexed the mule, I bet." They didn't answer, didn't hide either. Sometimes when they walked into town for supplies, she took his arm. And sometimes he placed a hand on the small of her back, like a promise no one else needed to hear. They built their house slow, but they built it true. The fence posts weren't straight, but they held. The windows didn't match, but they caught the light just fine. And every nail was a choice, not for perfection, but for permanence. When fall came, Calder carved a bench from 2 cedar logs and the remains of their old door frame. He didn't tell her, just placed it beneath the cottonwood, facing the field. One morning, she found it with a mug of coffee already sitting on the seat. Next to it, a folded note in his handwriting. "We waited alone once. Now we sit together, when we sit at all." Sometimes they did sit, after long days when the sky turned blood orange, or when the world felt too loud. They didn't always speak, but when her hand found his in the dark, that was enough. Winter came hard. They wrapped blankets around cracked window frames and stuffed old clothes beneath the doors. But they were warm, warmer than she ever remembered. And then, spring brought more than flowers. It brought breath, Tiny, fragile, human. They named the boy Creek because he came when the ice melted, when the world softened, when everything broken began to bloom. He had her eyes, his father's stillness, and a laugh that sounded like new grass and rain and stories yet to be told. They raised him slow, gentle, not with sermons or fences, but with songs in different languages and wild ponies for neighbors. One day, the old mule wandered to the porch. Creek reached out with a giggle, and Bucky, who hated everyone, stood perfectly still. Let the boy pet his ear. Let him climb onto his back. And when Calder stepped forward to help, Naya held out a hand. Let him, she whispered. Let the horse choose. Bucky carried the boy across the yard like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. Like all the weight he'd ever known had finally meant something. The town never quite stopped watching, but they stopped whispering, because nothing gossips louder than a happy ending. Years later, someone asked Creek who his parents were. He pointed to the man mending the fence barefoot and singing off-key, then to the woman braiding herbs into the porch rail and telling stories to the chickens. They're the ones who stayed, he said. And somewhere beneath the cottonwood tree, where the bench still sat, weathered but unbroken, where two mugs still waited, the wind carried an old silence, the kind that used to hurt, but now it just sounded like home. She wasn't the bride he wrote for, and he wasn't the man she thought she'd meet, but under that cottonwood tree, they became something no letter could ever promise. Real. What started on a splintered bench outside a dusty mail-order office ended in a home they built with blistered hands, soft silences, and a love that didn't ask permission. Maybe that's the kind of love that lasts out here. Not loud, not rushed, but the kind that stays. If this story spoke to something in you, if you felt the quiet between them, the courage in her stillness, the way he showed love not with words but with actions, leave us a comment below. We want to know what you'd have done if you sat on that bench. Would you have waited, or would you have stayed? Subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales like this one, where love isn't loud, but it echoes forever. Because out here, we don't just tell stories. We remember the ones worth telling. The snow fell light that morning, soft as breath, silent as regret. It layered the wooden platform of Sable Ridge Station in a thin, glistening coat, settling into the cracks of boots and the folds of coats. The train had long since hissed away, leaving behind a sky turned pale and one figure standing still in the cold. Iris Monroe didn't shift, didn't speak. Her satchel lay at her feet, the hem of her cloak stiff with snowmelt. In her hand, a letter, crumpled, unsent. She hadn't meant to be here. Not like this. The plan had belonged to her sister, but Clara had changed her mind. At the last moment, it was Iris who boarded the train. Iris who stepped off into the waiting silence of the West, wearing someone else's name. He stood by the wagon, tall, broad, unreadable. Luke Harlan didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. "You're not her," he said, voice low. "No," Iris replied, chin lifted. "But I came." He studied her, eyes colder than the wind. "Then let's go." And just like that, the wagon wheels creaked forward. She did not know what waited at the end of that road, only that it would not wait for her to be sure. The ride to the ranch was wordless. Luke Harlan held the reins with one gloved hand, the other resting loosely on his thigh. The wagon creaked in rhythm with the trail, wheels grinding against snow-packed ruts. The only sound was the wind and the occasional groan of wood settling in winter air. Iris Monroe sat straight, hands folded in her lap, the crushed letter tucked into her satchel beneath her feet. Her sister's name, Clara, still echoed in her ears, though no one had spoken it. She hadn't corrected him, not yet. The land rolled open around them, vast, white, and indifferent. When the house came into view, Iris drew in a breath. It was larger than she expected. Built from dark logs, the Harlan house stood tall against the rise of the hill, framed by pines and frost. Smoke rose from the chimney in slow, steady curls. A barn and two outbuildings crouched to the east, roofs thick with snow. Luke didn't glance at her as he brought the wagon to a stop. He climbed down, reached for her satchel, and waited. She stepped down without assistance. "You'll meet Miss Elspeth inside," he said. "She handles the house." That was all. Then he turned toward the barn, boots crunching over frozen gravel, and disappeared into the shadow of the open door. Inside, the house smelled of smoke, pine pitch, and boiled onions. The warmth hit Iris like a wall, turning her cold, stiff hands to tingling pins. A woman stood at the hearth, stirring something in a wide iron pot. Her hair was iron gray, coiled into a knot so tight it pulled her face taut. Her back was square, her silence louder than the fire. "You're the sister," the woman said, not turning. "The second one." Iris hesitated. "I'm Iris." At that, the spoon paused in its slow circle, then resumed. "You'll be staying in the north room. Wash basins full. Don't track mud on the rugs." "That's all?" Iris asked before she could stop herself. Now the woman turned. Her eyes were sharp as coal glass. "You were expected days ago, then not at all. What else would there be?" Iris lifted her chin. "Courtesy." Miss Elspeth gave a short huff. Not quite a laugh. "Then we'll both be disappointed." The room was clean, but cold. The bed had been made recently. Tight corners, fresh quilts. A single window overlooked the slope behind the barn. Frost etched the glass like lace. Iris unpacked slowly. A comb, a needle case, a scarf her mother had once hemmed. She ran her hand across the folded wool like it could answer something. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried on the train, nor when Clara pressed the ticket into her hand and whispered, "He doesn't have to know. Just go." She didn't cry when the station agent looked past her as though she were part of the snow. But now, alone in this unfamiliar room, with the heat from the stove fading and the silence pressing against her spine, now she felt the weight, but the tears still didn't come. Instead, she stood, unpinned her cloak, and folded it neatly over the chair. If she was going to be here, she would take up space. That evening, she found her way to the kitchen again, hands washed, hair braided back. Miss Elspeth handed her a bowl and a spoon without a word. Luke sat at the table, shoulders hunched, still in his work coat. He nodded once when she entered. Nothing more. They ate in silence. The stew was hearty. Salted meat, potatoes, a root she couldn't name. She ate slowly, listening to the scrape of spoons, the crack of the fire, and the wind clawing at the shutters. When her bowl was empty, she stood to rinse it in the basin. Luke spoke then. "You're not what I expected." She didn't turn. "Neither are you." He said nothing else. Later, as she lit the lamp in her room and pulled the quilts to her chest, she watched snow gather against the pane. A bird had left prints along the sill. She traced one faint track with her fingertip. She wondered if Clara was warm, if she regretted it, if she knew Iris hadn't come to save her, but to save something in herself. She didn't know what Luke thought of her, didn't much care yet. But something about the way he looked at the fire instead of her, the way he disappeared instead of explained, something about it felt familiar. She had always lived beside other people's choices, but now, in this strange, quiet place, she had made her own. No one asked her to stay. No one had to. She'd made that choice on the train, in the snow, in the echo of her sister's silence. She was here. She would stay, even if it meant carving her place one step, one breath, one frost-bitten morning at a time. The snow kept falling, day after day, soft and constant. Iris woke each morning to a world wrapped in white and a house wrapped in silence. She learned the sound of Luke's boots across the porch, the creak of Miss Elspeth's rocking chair, and the way the kettle whistled just before boiling. But no one spoke unless necessary. The days passed not with conversation, but with motion. Iris swept the floors. She folded linens. She learned where the firewood was stacked and how to bank the coals at night so the hearth would still be warm in the morning. No one told her to do these things, but no one stopped her either. On the fourth morning, she found a pair of boots at her door, worn but cleaned, lined with rabbit fur, her size. She picked them up carefully as though they might disappear if she blinked. At breakfast, she said nothing. Neither did Luke. But when he passed the stew pot in her direction, she noticed his eyes flick to her feet. He'd noticed she'd been wearing the wrong size, that the soles were cracked, that she hadn't said a word about it. That was the first quiet thing. The second came 2 days later. She'd been clearing ice from the porch rail when she slipped and scraped her palm against the rough wood. It wasn't deep, but it stung. She wrapped it in a clean cloth and said nothing. That night, beside her bowl, she found a small tin of ointment and a fresh length of bandage. Miss Elspeth didn't look up as she ladled stew. Luke didn't look up either, but Iris sat a little straighter as she reached for the tin. The third quiet thing was the coat. Not new, not beautiful, but warm. Miss Elspeth tossed it over the back of a chair without comment while Iris was shelling beans. "You'll need something better than that city cloak if you're walking the grounds," was all she said. Iris took it without hesitation. "Thank you." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd heard from the woman yet. Still, there were hard moments. The town, when she went in with Luke for supplies, was cold in a way the snow wasn't. She caught whispers behind gloved hands. "That's the sister. The second..." A girl behind the mercantile counter acted like she hadn't heard Iris's question. An old man outside the post office smirked when Luke introduced her. Not as a wife, but as Miss Monroe, staying on the ranch. The shame wasn't sharp. It was dull and persistent, like a stone in her boot. Not enough to stop her, just enough to remind her she didn't belong. Yet. One evening, Iris sat by the fire mending a torn curtain. Her stitching wasn't neat, but it was firm. Luke sat across from her, a ledger open in his lap, his pencil scraping slowly across the page. Miss Elspeth was knitting, her lips pressed tight as always. "I'd like to help with more," Iris said suddenly. Miss Elspeth raised an eyebrow without looking up. "You're helping just fine sitting there." "I have hands," Iris said. "They work. I want to use them." A long silence followed. Luke didn't speak, but his pencil paused mid-word. Then quietly he said, "You'll come with me to the east fence line tomorrow. I need someone to hold the post steady while I repack the ground." Iris looked up. "I can do that," she said. He nodded once. The next morning was cold enough to bite. Iris wore the boots he'd left her and the coat Miss Elspeth had given. The wind found every crack in the fabric, but she didn't complain. They didn't speak much on the way out. But when they reached the edge of the ranch, Luke handed her gloves without a word. "You'll need 'em," he said. He showed her how to brace the posts, how to wedge stones at the base, how to spot where the ground would shift come thaw. She listened, asked once or twice. He didn't smile, but he nodded when she did it right. By noon, her shoulders ached and her knees were wet from kneeling. But when Luke took the shovel from her hands and said, "That'll do," it felt like praise. Not loud, not warm, but real. That night, Iris sipped tea in the parlor. Luke came in late, coat dusted with snow, shoulders heavy with work. He didn't speak as he passed her, but just before he disappeared into the hallway, he paused. "You held that post steady," he said. She blinked. "I tried." "You did more than try." Then he walked on. In bed, Iris lay still, hands folded over her stomach. The house no longer felt like a shell. It still wasn't hers. Not yet. But the air had changed, slightly. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Tomorrow she'd offered to mend the barn door latch. Maybe he'd let her. Or maybe he wouldn't say a word and just leave a hammer near her chair. Either way, she was learning to listen to the quiet things, and slowly, quietly, they were beginning to speak back. The town of Sable Ridge wasn't cruel, just watchful. And in winter, everything lingered longer. Stares, words, judgment. It began at the mercantile. Iris had come with Luke to pick up seed and wire. The bell above the door jingled sharp in the stillness. The clerk behind the counter gave Luke a nod, but her eyes flicked past Iris as though she hadn't seen her at all. Two women stood near the stove, faces lined, gloves still on. Their conversation didn't pause, but their tone shifted. One glanced over. The other leaned in. "She's the sister," one whispered. "The one who stayed. The one who wasn't chosen." Iris pretended not to hear. She straightened her back, focused on the basket in her hands. Her fingers were red from the cold, but she didn't flinch. She walked the aisles, gathered what they needed, and placed each item with care. Luke approached the counter. "That'll be all." The clerk rang it up without a word to Iris. Didn't even look at her. Iris reached for her coin purse. Luke stopped her with a hand on her wrist. "I've got it." She let him. Not because she needed him to, but because there was nothing to prove in that moment. Only something to endure. As they stepped outside, wind caught the edge of her scarf. Luke adjusted the wagon rope, then paused. "You heard them," he said. "I did." "You care?" "I didn't say that." He nodded. "They'll forget." "I don't need them to forget," she said. "I just need to outlast them." That earned her a look, not of pity, but recognition. Then he helped her up into the wagon, as if it had always been that way. That afternoon, Miss Elspeth watched her sweep the porch, arms folded tight. "You let 'em see they got to you, and they'll keep coming." Iris didn't stop sweeping. "I didn't break," she said. "No," Miss Elspeth said slowly. "You didn't." It wasn't a compliment. Later that week, Luke found her mending the loose hinge on the barn door. She didn't ask permission. She'd noticed it, found the tools, and done it. He watched a moment, then said, "You're too stubborn for your own good." "I'll take that as encouragement." He didn't smile, but something softened in his shoulders. "You're earning your place." She looked up. "I didn't know it had to be earned." "Everything does out here." She stood slowly, brushing sawdust from her skirt. "Then I'll keep at it." Luke nodded. "You'll want a room with better light if you're going to keep stitching." She blinked. "What?" "The front room. It's warmer. Window faces the east." "I thought that was storage." "Not anymore." He walked away then, like it wasn't a decision, just a fact. But Iris stood still in the doorway for a long moment. She hadn't asked for a different room, but she had earned one. That night, as she folded her clothes into the trunk at the foot of the new bed, Miss Elspeth appeared in the doorway. "Your sister would have left by now." Iris didn't turn around. "Maybe. She was always the loud one, wasn't she?" "Yes." "You're different." Iris looked over her shoulder. "Do you think that's good?" Miss Elspeth shrugged. "Depends on the man." Iris smiled faintly. "And what do you think of Luke?" Miss Elspeth stepped into the room, ran a hand over the window frame. "He's quiet, hard but not cruel, and he watches things he doesn't know how to name." "Like me." "Like you." The next time they went into town, Iris walked 2 steps behind Luke, not out of habit but to observe. The same 2 women stood by the stove, same clerk, same sideways glances. But when Luke introduced her, this time, not as the woman staying at the ranch, but simply as Iris Monroe, something shifted. No title, no explanation, just her name spoken clearly. The clerk met her eyes, nodded once. Small, but enough. Later that evening, Iris found Luke in the barn, checking on a calf born early. "You didn't have to say my name," she said. "I know." "But you did." "I did." She stepped forward. "Why?" Luke looked up, hay clinging to his sleeves, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Because you're not a secret." That stopped her breath for a beat. Then she nodded. "Thank you." He returned to the calf, but his next words came soft. "I didn't think I needed anyone when I sent for your sister." "I wasn't sent." "No," he said. "You came." And that, she realized, made all the difference. That night, Iris sat in the front room, lamp lit, sewing needle moving smoother than before. Miss Elspeth passed by and paused. "You've made it yours," she said. Iris looked up. "What?" "This room. The house. Him." "I'm not sure about that." "You will be. It's not about grand gestures. It's about who keeps showing up." Iris smiled. "I'll be here in the morning," she said. Miss Elspeth gave a rare smile in return. "Then you'll do just fine." The storm rolled in without warning. It came not with thunder, but with wind, sharp, fast, unrelenting. Snow pelted the windows sideways, stinging like sand. Shutters groaned. The barn doors moaned against their latches. Luke stood at the porch railing, coat drawn tight, jaw clenched. Iris watched from the parlor window, a basket of kindling at her feet, her breath fogging the glass. But it wasn't the weather that made him tense. It was the letter folded in his coat pocket. Harlan Finch, a rancher from the next valley over, wanted a piece of Luke's land, the northern edge, claimed the boundary lines had shifted, that Luke had no right to it, that it'd be best for everyone if he just signed it over and kept the peace. Luke had burned the first letter. The second came with a visit. Finch rode in just before dusk, flanked by two men with hard eyes and easy rifles. The snow had begun to drift, wind biting. But Luke didn't stay inside. He met them in the yard, no gun, no hat, only his coat and the weight of his silence. Iris stepped out onto the porch behind him, shawl pulled tight. Miss Elspeth stood just behind the door, arms crossed, eyes like flint. Finch smirked beneath his wool scarf. "Heard you got yourself a new girl playing house up here." Luke didn't blink. "Say what you came to say." Finch's eyes shifted to Iris. "Just wondering if she's the reason you're getting soft." Luke stepped forward. "I said, say it." Finch's grin dropped. "You've got till spring thaw to get off that land. You ain't got sons, you ain't got allies. What you got is a woman pretending she's part of something." Iris took a step down the stairs. Luke's voice came low, sharp. "That's enough." But Iris didn't stop. She stepped out into the yard, boots sinking into snow, until she stood beside him. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. "She's not pretending," she said. "And neither are you. You came here to threaten what doesn't belong to you." Finch spat into the snow. "I came here because men like Harland used to matter. Now you're just a shadow, hiding behind skirts." Luke's hand flexed. Iris turned toward him, eyes calm. "You don't need to speak for me." She faced Finch again. "If you want that land, file a claim like everyone else. But don't expect to scare someone who's already lived through being forgotten." That landed. Finch's mouth worked, but no words came. Behind him, one of his men looked away. The other adjusted his reins. Luke finally spoke. "Ride out, Harlan, before the storm buries your pride along with your threat." For a long beat, Finch didn't move. Then he clicked his tongue. The horses turned. No shots fired. No deals made. Just the sound of snow under hooves as they vanished into the white. Back inside, Iris shed her shawl with trembling fingers. Miss Elspeth handed her a mug of tea without a word, but her eyes held something warmer than they ever had before. Luke didn't speak until the fire had been stoked, until the windows rattled less, until the silence had softened. "You didn't have to step in," he said. "I know." He looked at her then, really looked. "You weren't afraid." "I was," she said, "but I'm more afraid of becoming small again." That earned her a long pause, then a single nod. "I won't let that happen," he said, and something in her chest, not pride, not fear, settled. The storm lasted 3 days. Snow piled against the doors. Wind howled through every crack. Inside, they moved like people used to long winters. Quiet, steady, present. Luke repaired a hinge. Iris mended a coat. Miss Elspeth baked bread with a rhythm older than patience. Each evening the fire crackled, and the silences felt less like absence, more like space. On the second night, Iris found a scrap of wood near the hearth. She began carving, slow, uneven. Nothing fancy, just the shape of something small trying to form. Luke noticed, didn't say a word, but on the third night he left a sharper carving knife beside the basket of kindling. No note, just a tool, an offering. When the storm broke, the sky came blue and wide. The house no longer felt like something she had entered. It felt like something she had helped hold together. That night, as Luke stepped onto the porch, Iris followed. They didn't speak, but their shoulders touched as they leaned against the rail, watching the thaw begin. And sometimes that was all the speaking the heart needed. The ice had not melted yet, but the roads had softened, just enough to tempt a man into trusting them. Luke set out early with the wagon, headed toward the far edge of the property, where the last of the fencing had cracked beneath the winter's heavy hands. "I'll be back before dusk," he'd said, his voice steady, usual, as if promises still meant something to the land. Iris had handed him a scarf she'd mended the night before. He'd taken it without a word, but his fingers had brushed hers just briefly. She'd watched from the porch as he disappeared down the trail, the wheels leaving shallow cuts in the slush-covered earth. By dusk, the wind had shifted. By dark, snow began again, sharp, dry, wind-driven. By full nightfall, he hadn't returned. Iris lit every lantern in the house, one by one. She paced, poured tea, didn't drink it. Miss Elspeth said nothing, but her knitting slowed. At some point, Iris pulled on her boots and coat, grabbed the spare lantern, and stepped outside. The air bit hard at her cheeks. She made it as far as the edge of the barn trail before Miss Elspeth's voice called her back. "You won't find him in this," she said. Iris turned, eyes wide and hollow. "Then who will?" Silence. She stood there a moment longer, snow layering in her hair, her scarf, the creases of her gloves. Then came the sound, faint at first, a dragging crunch, uneven hooves, a single wheel skidding sideways. Iris ran. When she reached the edge of the yard, the lantern swung wildly in her hand. The shape emerged from the dark. The wagon tilted, Luke hunched low over the reins, blood staining his sleeve. "Horse slipped near the ravine," he said, voice raw. I rolled. Iris was already climbing up beside him, taking the reins, steadying the horse. Miss Elspeth was at the door with blankets by the time they reached the house. Iris cleared the table. Together they peeled off his coat, revealing a gash across his upper arm. Long, shallow, ugly. "He needs stitches," Miss Elspeth muttered. "I'll do what I can," Iris said. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes did not. She cleaned the wound with water gone cold from neglect, wrapped it tight, pressed her palm flat to stop the bleeding. "You should have sent someone," she whispered. "There's no one else," Luke murmured. Her hand stilled at that, but she said nothing, only finished binding the wound. They got him into bed. He didn't fight it, didn't argue, just lay back with a grunt and closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow, but even. Iris pulled up a chair. She sat there for hours, changing the cloth, checking his pulse, feeding the fire when it dipped too low. Around dawn, his brow furrowed, his lips parted. "Clara," he mumbled. Iris leaned closer, heart tightening. "No," she whispered, "I'm not her, and I don't want to be." The words hung in the air between them, soft and sure. Luke didn't wake, but something in the room shifted, less like longing, more like release. For 3 days he drifted in and out. Miss Elspeth brought broth. Iris fed him slowly, wiping his mouth with care. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for thanks. She read aloud from a book she'd found near the hearth. Not because he asked, but because the silence had changed, and because part of her wanted to know what stories filled his quiet mind. On the second night, she found a wooden carving on the mantel, half-shaped, unfinished. A bird, small, rough, edges still sharp from the knife. No initials, no meaning attached. But she held it for a long while. Someone had tried to make something out of nothing, and she understood that language. By the 4th day, he woke clear-eyed. "Iris," he said, voice hoarse. She looked up from her stitching. "I'm here." "Thank you." "You're welcome." He shifted slightly, wincing. "You shouldn't have had to. You didn't give me much choice." A flicker of something passed over his face. Regret? Shame? Relief? She poured him water, watched him drink. "You ought not to go riding alone," she said softly. Luke leaned back on the pillow. "Didn't plan to fall. You never do." That night he came into the parlor, arm in a sling, coat still damp from snow. Iris sat at the table, folding towels by the fire. "You remind me of someone," he said, voice quiet. She looked up. "Who?" "My mother." She blinked. "Is that a compliment?" "She was the strongest person I ever knew." That stopped her. She didn't answer, but something inside her, some small, long-hardened part, softened. Not romantic, not dramatic, just warm. The next morning, Iris brewed tea early, before even Miss Elspeth stirred. Luke joined her in the kitchen, moving stiffly but steady. He poured her a cup before his own. "I'm not good with word," he said finally. "I've noticed." She smiled a little. He did too, barely, but it was there. "I'm better with showing." She nodded. "Then show me." He passed her a wrapped bundle. Inside, a pair of gloves, worn but mended. The seams weren't perfect, but the lining was soft, warm, made by hand. "I remember you said yours didn't fit. You made these?" "I tried." She slid them on. "They're perfect." He nodded once, said nothing more. But when they stood beside the window, shoulder to shoulder, their reflection in the glass didn't look like strangers anymore. Outside, the frost still clung to the porch rail, but inside, the fire between them had finally taken. No blaze, No heat to burn, just a steady warmth, the kind that stays. The thaw had just begun, loosening the trails enough for a wagon to pass. Iris stood on the porch of the Harlan Ranch, brushing snow off the railing with her gloved hand. Beneath the frost, she could feel the wood warming in the sun. The ground was still hard, but no longer bitter. Behind her, Luke came out carrying 2 feed sacks, his arm still in a sling but steadier now. He paused, watching her. "You miss her?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said without turning. "Mostly the way we were, when we were girls." Luke nodded. "You're not like her." "No," Iris replied softly. "But she wasn't wrong either. She just didn't want this life." "And you do?" She looked at him then, her eyes clear. "I didn't think I would. But some things grow better in snow than in sun. You just have to wait long enough." Before Luke could answer, a sound broke the stillness. The crunch of wheels, the clop of hooves, slow and deliberate. They both turned. A carriage rolled into the yard, and stepped down from it, dressed in a fine traveling coat with a fur-lined collar, was Clara Monroe. She stood at the edge of the yard, surveying the porch, the rail, the house that was never meant for her. "You look tired," she said. Iris stepped forward. "I've been working." Clara's mouth twitched. "You don't have to do this." "I know. Then come home." Iris walked down the steps until they were face to face. "I am home." Behind her, Luke appeared on the porch. He said nothing, just watched. Clara's gaze shifted between them. "You care for him?" she asked. Iris didn't answer with words. She didn't have to. She stood tall, steady, sure. "No shame in changing your mind," Clara said quietly. "There's no shame in choosing it in the first place," Iris replied. For a long moment, the sisters stood in the cold, the thawed earth beneath their feet muddy with truth. Clara nodded once. "You always were the one who stayed too long in things. And you always left too early." That brought the faintest smile to Clara's face. "Maybe we were both wrong." "Maybe," Iris said. "But this time, I'm not leaving." Clara glanced at Luke, who gave her a slow, respectful nod. Then she turned back toward the carriage and left. No drama, no last word. Just the sound of wheels fading into the woods. That evening, Iris unpacked what little she had taken from the drawers. She placed her scarf back over the chair, her sewing into the basket, her book back on the shelf. Later, Luke came in from the barn. His boots were damp, his hair windblown. He didn't speak at first, just stood near the fire. Then he said, "You didn't owe her an answer." "I didn't give her one. I gave myself one." Luke nodded. "Will you stay?" he asked. "I already have." He took a step forward. "Not as Clara's sister." "No." He met her eyes. "Then as who?" "As myself." He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but his voice, low and certain, carried more than any gesture. "That's all I ever wanted." "No," she said gently. "It isn't, but it's a start." Spring crept in slowly. The snow didn't vanish. It retreated, bit by bit, leaving behind soggy footprints and the promise of green. Luke dug holes along the front fence. Iris followed, planting lilac roots, gently, reverently, speaking to them as if they were children. "These'll take years to bloom," Luke said. "I've got time," she answered. He watched her fingers press the soil into place. "You make things grow," he said. "So do you," she replied. "You just don't know it yet." That night he brought her a book. No inscription, just one sentence written inside the cover. For Iris, who stayed. She didn't cry, but she touched the page like it meant something sacred. In town, people still whispered, "She's the second," not even his wife. A stand-in, a shadow. But Iris didn't flinch anymore. Because every morning, Luke poured her coffee before his own. Because she had learned the weight of the house, the language of its creaks, and the rhythm of a life built not in declarations, but in presence. And one morning, Luke took her hand across the table. Rough, calloused, steady. "I'd marry you," he said. "If you asked." She laughed. "You're supposed to ask me." He shrugged. "I'm better at showing." "Then show me." He did, not with a ring, but with a second chair placed beside hers at the porch, with a coat hung next to his by the door, with a shelf carved just for her books. Years later, they'd say the Harlan Ranch always smelled like lilacs after the frost. They wouldn't talk much about Clara or how it all started, but they would remember Iris, the quiet one, the one who knocked anyway, the one who stayed. Not every story begins with love. Some begin with silence, with snow, with a girl who wasn't chosen, but stayed anyway. Iris Monroe wasn't the first name on the letter, but she was the one who built the fire, planted the lilacs, and stood her ground when it mattered. And sometimes that's how the truest kind of love begins. Not by being asked, but by arriving and staying. Tell us in the comments, would you have stayed in Iris's place? Which moment stirred you the most? What did you think of Luke's quiet transformation? And we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? These quiet stories travel farther than we ever expected, and we're so glad you're part of this little frontier family. And maybe, just maybe, there's another chapter waiting, a new story, a letter unopened, a heart not yet spoken for. If this story meant something to you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in slow-blooming love. Until next ride, partner. And remember, sometimes the quiet ones write the loudest legacies.